Reverend Kristen.
Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see so many of you here today. My name is Reverend Kristen Schmidt. I am the settled minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Silver Spring in Maryland, just outside the nation's capital. And I have the privilege of serving on the board of UUSJ. So I am glad to be here. And I invite you now into a time of centering, reflection, and prayer. So let's take a deep breath. There is so much calling to our minds and to our hearts, both in our own lives and in our world. And as I light our chalice, let's take a moment to arrive, not just in body, not just in Zoom login, but in mind and heart and spirit as well. Good with us, God with us, for the beauty of bare branches and reddest berries and evergreen trees, for crisp mornings and the song of winter birds, we lift up our hearts in thanks. We give thanks for the season of ancient stories, miraculous lights, reassurance that all seasons come and go, and the birth of hope when it's hardest to find. For many of us, this is a season filled with joy and wonder, parties and concerts, laughter, generosity. People relish these days devoted to reading and cooking, children and family, traditions and recipes handed down through the generations. And yet, with each new day, new story, personal challenge, and loss, we are confronted with all of the ways this world of ours is suffering, is aching, is broken. In these days when so much death and despair surrounds us, we wait, wondering how long the oil will last while we burn our candle from both ends, watching for signs that things will finally change, that the shift we've all been waiting for will finally happen, that somehow, against all odds, truth and justice, peace and mercy will overwhelm this weary world of ours. In this season of waiting, many of us ache. We ache for some help, for a break, for forgiveness or rest or friends, for friends and loved ones who are unwell, for people who are being held as hostages, for people living in war zones. We ache for those who live only in our memories. And so we pray. We pray for the day when love will overwhelm the world, when all people will have enough, when, as the old song goes, hope will sing its triumph and sadness flee away. Good with us, God with us, we are both thankful and aching, joyful and sorrow-filled. And yet through it all, we cannot lose faith, for the days of growing bleakness and decay will pass. The winter will not last forever. The sun and longer days of warmth and growth will return. And one day we will have cause to rejoice again. Inequity will melt. Justice will roll down like waters and peace like an ever-flowing stream. For the day of hope, the day of peace and joy and love is coming. And we will be ready. We will watch and we will wait. And together we will do all we can to prepare the way. May it be so. Amen. The Reverend Cecilia Kingman has dedicated her life to the study of authoritarian systems. After the collapse of the communist dictatorship in Romania, she spent 2 decades working with the Unitarians of Transylvania to strengthen civil society and support sustainable agriculture and community development. She's currently doing doctoral work at the Pacific School of Religion on the responses of faith communities to fascist and totalitarian regimes. Cecilia graduated from Star King School for the Ministry in 2003 and has served congregations in Oregon and Washington, most recently serving as the Minister for Faith and Justice at the Edmonds Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Edmonds, Washington. Last year, she served our faith as director of the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt's successful campaign for UUA president. Cecilia lives in the greater Seattle area where she's active in interfaith organizing. She's the mother of 4 children, 2 of whom are still in school, and outside of her work as parent and minister, she nourishes her spirit by caring for a number of animals and a very large vegetable garden. I have come to deeply respect Cecilia in each of these roles, but it is her collegial spirit and her faithfulness that make me call Cecilia my friend. Ministry can be a hard business, especially when we encounter dysfunction at the institutional level. Cecilia has been an exceptional colleague, not just to me, but to many others, especially when we found ourselves in those kinds of situations. I've grown in my faith through her example, and I've appreciated her spiritual vulnerability and insights just as much as her deep analysis of all sorts of systems. With a deep appreciation for who she is as a full person, professional as well as personal, it is my privilege and my pleasure to introduce you to the Reverend Cecilia Kingman.
Oh, Kristen, thank you so much for that introduction, but also that beautiful, beautiful prayer. You said a line in there that's just, I had to write it down, something about the days of growing bleakness and iniquity will not last forever. And I just really appreciate that reminder as I'm about to talk about, a not so cheerful subject. So thank you for that. And thank you all for inviting me to be with you this evening. I'm really, I have to say, it's not fun to be someone well-versed in these topics. It's not a particularly joyful thing to bring this word to Unitarian Universalists and others over and over again. And but it is necessary, and I hope it's useful to us. So without saying more about that, I do want to say that I was invited to talk on any subject that I am interested in, or any further reflections I've had since writing the and delivering the Berry Street essay last summer, early summer at General Assembly. Pablo gave me the full spread of invitation to that. And so what I'd really like to talk about tonight, I want to catch you up a little bit on just what I've been reading and thinking about, and some of what I've been doing as well in that process. I want to pull us back tonight from the very specific question of fascism and authoritarianism in the United States alone, because my interest is much larger than that, and my academic work is larger than that, but also because some of the things that I have experienced this summer, some of the work that I have been doing, some of the research that I've been doing has brought me into my own greater awareness and understanding of exactly how global this move towards authoritarianism is, and some of the thinkers who've been inspiring me, who I've been reading. So I like to say, some of the people who've been keeping me up at night. So I want to share some of that with you. I'm going to start just with an awareness that this rise in fascism and authoritarianism is escalating around the globe. We know some of the typical places, we talk a lot in our circles, in progressive and liberal circles, about what's going on in Hungary and our own Republican, far-right Republicans, their close ties to the Orban regime there. Certainly talk about some of the new the rise of the right in Italy and in Chile, now in Argentina, of course in Russia, certainly in India, and definitely now very much in the news, the government of Netanyahu in Israel. And all of those share some of these key components of authoritarian regimes. So I want to share with you and commend to you a recent article by Alberto Toscano in These Times magazine, in which he talks about the three core elements of all of these movements. And these will be familiar to any of you who've been looking at fascism and authoritarianism here in the United States nationally, but they're also components globally. So the first is the Great Replacement theory. I think probably you all know what that is. The idea that there is some sort of international plot to replace, quote, native populations, native meaning people who are who are rightfully or always there, native populations with migrants. And this is a racist and anti-Semitic trope. It's usually blaming, quote, globalist Jewish elites for this plot. So I just want to really call that out in these days, that this is a very particular form of anti-Semitism that gets activated. This idea of these international plot. Number two is what I would call a frantic concern about gender, specifically homophobic and transphobic claims that society has been sort of taken over by an anti-family gender ideology. And we can see that as well in the rise in attempts to control women's bodies, attempt to control those of us who have uterus, the reproductive rights battles. All of those are related to this, but the intensity of the transphobia in the United States is mirrored as well around the globe. And then number three is what Toscano calls a backlash against the challenges to the racial capitalist order. So challenges to the racial capitalist order, we have those, though we generally, progressives and liberals are generally on the side of those challenges to the racial capitalist order. And a backlash is what we're seeing in these far-right movements. From here in the US, where the right-wing Republicans attack critical race theory, to anti-woke campaigns around the globe. In Italy, they call it il wokismo, which I find both funny and disturbing. Il wokismo is considered to be a problem. The French have a term for it, which now I can't remember, but all over this woke has become a term that's being used in all of these countries and throughout the globe. It's even come up in places that we might think would be somewhat more immune to them, like Scandinavian countries. So the international rise in the far right movements is highly collaborative, and it is spreading through intentional cross-pollination. These folks are gathering in conferences, they're sharing communication strategies and technologies and more. And Toscano says that we need to ask why the culture wars are the preferred field of operations. I think that's a really interesting question. Toscano points out that though the international far right is having media and electoral success here abroad, those successes do not actually manifest, they don't correlate to a similar success in numbers of followers, the numbers of people engaged, number of citizens engaged. Toscano says, and I quote, "The electoral far right captures, nourishes, and weaponizes many of what philosopher Baruch Spinoza called the sad passions, fear, resentment, hatred. But it rarely organizes them," he says. It rarely organizes around these sad passions. Here in the United States, we see rallies, but far-right Republicans, to win, they typically have to engage in gerrymandering, voter suppression, all of these mechanical responses to gain power, and then they have to continue to suppress voters or cheat even to remain in power. And in other countries, we see further further crimes, actually, in order to maintain power. So the far right does not organize. I think this is so interesting, especially Kristen, what we were talking about before we had folks come on, this question of like, are we organizing? Are they out organizing us? They're actually not organizing, they're activating. And that's a very different task, very different set of behaviors that these leaders of these movements are engaged in. These far right movements, they seek to separate people from the body politic. They actually want people to feel disconnected and disassociated from the endeavor of citizenship, from the endeavor of being involved as a member of society. The far right will inflame resentments and stoke violence, but it does not organize or build community. It does nothing to counter the despair and atomization of our age, because it needs that despair, that sense of isolation that people have, to bolster its own power. Toscano writes, in a time of disillusionment, the global far right is feeding off the false promises of a reformist social democracy and the failed efforts of true challenges to the status quo. As many progressives have lost hope in the viability of progress, I'm going to read that part again, as many progressives have lost hope in the viability of progress, the possessive and punitive instincts of the far right become more attractive to a disoriented and disgruntled electorate. In many countries, a well-articulated political project is not necessary, Toscano says. A well-articulated political project is not necessary to sway a sizable proportion of the public to believe that excluding others will secure their meager slice of an ever-shrinking pie. When I read this passage, it just took my breath away to realize the ways in which I had been thinking about how we might begin to really counter this global movement, that they don't need a well-articulated or organized political project in order to sway the people. And in fact, they don't even really need to convince the people, because what they're after are not actually the majority of the votes. And that's a very difficult piece for us, especially we Unitarian Universalists who are so steeped in the practices of democracy. It's very difficult, I think, for us to grasp this, that's not their aim. That is not, in fact, their aim is the eradication of the electoral project. That's their aim. So knowing that, Toscano goes on, endless mobilizing for culture wars, he says, is, to paraphrase W.E.B. Du Bois, a cheap way of raising psychological wages while the real ones decline. Less bread, more circuses. Less bread, more circuses. That just gives me a chill when I read that. Toscano has some thoughts on how we counter such a global movement, but before I share those, I want to examine a little more this idea of hope. What he called the progressives' loss of faith in progress. Last night I was watching a movie on Netflix. It's called Munich, something like Munich, the beginning of the war, Munich, the lead up to war. So something that's not a documentary. I'm not getting the title quite exactly right now, but it's a fictionalized account of those last days when England, in particular, when the British were meeting with Hitler and trying to prevent the invasion of the Czech territories, and there's a character in that who says, he's actually one of the Germans who was originally kind of enraptured by the restoration of national hopes that Hitler was selling. And then he becomes deeply disillusioned and begins to see Hitler for the monster that he was. And he is talking to a friend of his, a British diplomat. And this actually the personal secretary to the prime minister. And he says, the British person, in classic British style, I just have to say, as someone who is descended from Brits and, has a lot of affection for their optimism, in classic British style, the Englishman is saying, well, you have to have hope. Like, it can't all be over. The German man is saying, like, it's all over. It's over. And he says, oh, you have to have hope. And the German diplomat says, hope, that's a word people use for when you are wanting someone else to do the work, when you think someone else is going to save you. And he says it's a quality that we should have much less of. Something like this. I'm paraphrasing. It was late and I was sleepy while I was watching this movie. But anyhow, that phrase woke me right up. Like, hope. That's the term we use when we're thinking that someone else is going to take care of this problem. And I am not accusing any of us, myself or any of you, with believing that it still might be possible for someone else to do something. But this piece about the loss of hope as becoming the moment when the real action towards resistance starts is one that I'm really interested in right now and focusing a lot on in my scholarship around when do people of faith actually begin to take deep risks in their effort to resist totalitarian regimes or authoritarian regimes. So I just want to lift that up, that piece about when progressives are having a loss of faith in progress, this sort of, we Unitarian Universalists are onward and upward for the progress of mankind. It's like that was one of our deep founding beliefs, is that things were always going to improve. And I think that we have successfully interrogated that belief, or at least begun to interrogate that belief. But there is this sense, is there not, amongst so many of us, of just this like, well, maybe history is not going to get better. Maybe that arc of history bending towards justice, maybe that's not true. Maybe it doesn't actually happen. A sense of that despair, right? And so I want you to just hold on to this question for a moment about this despair and what we do with this despair, because I want to bring in now the work of Jeff Halper, whose book War Against the People has been giving me a lot to chew on as well. Halper is an Israeli anthropologist and is the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee. The American Friends Service Committee nominated him and a Palestinian, a colleague of his, for the Peace Prize. And Halper's book, his work, examines what he calls securocratic governments. So this was a term that was fairly new to me when I began to read his book. Securocratic governments. Securocratic regimes create a permanent state of war against an internal enemy or enemies, marked by intelligence services that are highly active within the borders as well as without, a highly militarized police, repression of civil liberties for not just those deemed the internal enemy, but anyone who is resisting or anyone who's supporting the rights of that internal enemy or is resisting the regime themselves. So the repression of civil liberties, criminalization of dissent, and it's all of these activities with the aim of preventing any resistance from taking hold. And Halper talks about securocratic wars, a war against resistance this war is waged by capitalist oligarchs. They're always the favorite bad guys, right? But they really are the bad guys in this story. Capitalist oligarchs who will not allow any resistance to global transnational late stage capitalism. Okay, so and somebody's asking bureaucratic or no, it's securocratic. Yes, you have it right. Securocratic, as in the security state, a securocracy. It's a funny word, but it's really intriguing and very useful. So any movement, any group which resists the hegemony of corporate and political elites will be targeted in this securocratic warfare. And much of Halper's work describes how governments around the globe are sharing with each other and selling to one another the techniques and technologies of securocratic warfare. So this brings me to not what I've been reading, but some of what I have been doing this past summer and fall. I had the extraordinary privilege of being invited by our Unitarian Universalist Side with Love team to go down to Atlanta and witness for myself and be with and provide some support to the folks there who are resisting the what they call Cop City, this big police training urban warfare facility that is being built. And you probably have heard about it. If you have not, I highly urge you to look into the Side with Love team's work on this. Comes out of our work as Unitarian Universalists, comes out of a vote taken at General Assembly for we Unitarian Universalists to directly counter this the building of Cop City. So I had the opportunity to go down and witness the local leadership and participate in one of their trainings and get to know some of the Unitarian Universalist leaders on the ground there, and have been since that time observing and trying to do what I can to support those leaders in the limited way that I can from all the way in Seattle. And this is just a tremendously fascinating example of resistance in the face of severe repression. So the activists there have been, well, one of them was killed. A number of them have been jailed. People have been jailed for things like handing out flyers. All of us who participated in, we did some canvassing while I was down there. I helped canvass. And all of us who participated in that had our names released by the city's employees, as you know, in a way that could make doxing possible. I only managed to canvass just briefly, so my name is on one sheet. I'm not telling you this because I'm personally concerned about this, but because the people who have been deep in the work are definitely in danger of being doxxed or other forms of retaliation to this work. So look up Stop Cop City, go to the Side with Love campaign and look at this. And here's the thing that's really interesting about this facility in this conversation about global securocratic warfare. The Georgia has a collaboration with the Israeli military. It's an agreement called GILI, which stands for, I always get this wrong, so let me just get it right here, for the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, or GILI program. And what happens in this program is that members of the Israeli occupying forces are brought to Georgia, or in some cases, Georgia law enforcement goes to Israel to share techniques for urban warfare against civilian populations. If that doesn't strike a sobering note in our conversation. I don't know what else would. And this is just an example of the kind of sharing that's going on in this global securocratic warfare models. So sharing technology. I mean, we provide enormous amount of aid to the Netanyahu government and to Israel, but we also are having this influx of techniques and technologies that's coming back that is specifically for urban repression, or what Halper calls the pacification of the population. This is a project of pacification. So in this training facility, which is massive, and it is not the only one, nor it is not the first, nor is it the last of these Cop City massive urban warfare training facilities to be built in the United States. There are dozens of them and many, many more plans. But this is the example that we're currently, as Unitarian Universalists, resisting and organizing around. And I just want you to grasp the immensity of this idea that in order to protect transnational capitalism, countries are trading techniques and tactics and technologies for repression of citizens, okay? For repression, not just of internal enemies, but of resistors, okay? So people who are working on the front lines in Atlanta are just tremendously courageous, and I'm just profoundly moved. I truly think that the work of resistance that's happening there is a model for all of us to look at and to follow. So I commend that research to you. So in this Gilly program, the Israeli occupying forces train the police in Georgia in this forms of political repression, and the intent to pacify the population. And according to Halper, this pacification is considered necessary by the ruling political and corporate elites in order to ensure domestic hegemony, okay? There is increasing cooperation among countries, even so-called democratic countries like the United States, like Israel and elsewhere, increasing cooperation to further strengthen this internal policing of their populations. And here in the United States, we have a long history of wielding violence against Indigenous and Black people and other marginalized folks. However, we now have a rapidly escalating sophistication level of the technologies used to surveil all of these folks, both the internal enemies and anyone who resists. I think if I have one hope for what you might take away from this evening, from this conversation, it is that Donald Trump is only the tip of the iceberg here, and our focusing on one person, and believe you me, I don't sleep well at night because of thinking about what will happen in the next election if Donald Trump is elected. However, this problem is so much larger than one narcissistic personality, okay? And these global securocratic forces are rapidly expanding and preying upon the despair of our age, the despair that people feel. So, what is to be done? This was a nice short essay. So, what is to be done with these incredibly grim realities? Halper says that the task before progressives today is to raise activism to the level of effective counter hegemony. To raise activism, to move beyond just resisting to the telling of new stories, to the creation of counter mythologies, to effective counter hegemony. Okay. And I want to give Halper and Toscano the last words here before we break for some questions, because I can't possibly say it any better than they would. So let me just give you these the last words here. So this is from Halper's War Against the People. Seeking to overthrow the capitalist world system in its entirety, out of an evaluation that it is inherently exploitative, unequal, and unsustainable, is what we mean by anti-systemic. While people on the left generally agree that capitalism is unsustainable, if only for environmental reasons, and favor more socialistic systems, we have neither formulated nor effectively mobilized for a fundamentally new world system. If such a truly revolutionary movement is still out of our reach, the wholesale destruction wrought by capitalism and the immense disparities of wealth and opportunity it has created, particularly in its neoliberal form, may yet trigger systemic collapse. Islamic militants and Messianic Jews and Christians, among others, know exactly what system should succeed it. Hopefully, he says, hopefully the progressive left could scramble in the event of collapse, and if not exactly proactive, manage to offer an alternative world system of its own. That's Halper's last word. And this is Toscano's. We might need to think about German philosopher Walter Benjamin's call to organize pessimism. Remember what I said about pessimism? To organize pessimism and what that looks like today, not offloading the pathologies of contemporary capitalism onto the wretched of the earth, nor looking for scapegoats to assuage our dread, but collectivizing our catastrophic condition, realizing that the imaginary security of a few can't be bought at the cost of the disposability of most of humanity. In this conspiratorial imagination of today's far right, we can glimpse, as in a funhouse mirror, what the left we need looks like. To the far right, the left is an agent of monumental change on the brink of destroying the oil industry, abolishing prisons and police, undermining private property, and upending white Western civilization. In other words, Toscano says, the left of the far right's nightmares is systematically undoing the causes of so much of our misery. It is organizing despair. To leftists facing contemporary reaction in the waking world, one might say, be everything they fear you are. And so that is what I think we have as a task before us as people of faith, to be everything they fear we are.
Thank you so much, Reverend Cecilia. So now I'm going to join you on in the spotlight, and I'm going to try and organize and shepherd some questions for us this evening. We are recording, so I'm going to privilege those in the audience who are brave enough to raise their electronic hand and ask the question themselves. But I do want to give people a moment to find that electronic hand under the reaction button and decide what their question is going to be. And I'm going to say the following. First off, yes, this is a sobering discussion that we're having this evening. And I appreciate that folks are tuning in. I think we all have to think through these issues and figure out how we are going to mobilize to change our current circumstance. But I want to say to the audience, fundamentally at UUSJ, we are about creating a movement for federal advocacy. And so that really is, the work of the counter mythology. It's the work of organizing that pessimism about what the Congress is doing and saying, hey, wait a minute, we don't agree. So I invite you to pay attention to what UUSJ does. You know, we have a Democracy Action Team, one of the co-sponsors for this event this evening. They're engaged in all those issues. We have an environment and climate justice team that cares deeply about a variety of pieces of legislative vehicles and concerns. We also have an economic justice team, and we have an immigration justice team. So with that in mind, one of the comments in the chat goes to deep concern for how this narrative change, how this conversation and flirtation with fascism globally, really, as you've articulated, is sort of at the root of intransigence and intolerance around immigration. Could you speak a little more about how you see those two things working together?
Yeah, first let me just say that I have right here in my notes to commend the work of UUSJ, and I went right past it. So yes, absolutely. I just want to sing out. I wouldn't be doing this event for you all tonight if I didn't firmly believe in the work that you're all about here. So I have to talk about immigration. I have to take a bit like a step back to say, like, what causes migration, right? Like we forget sometimes that all of these forces are global, and that people migrate because of climate disaster, or because of the United States or some other colonial power or post-colonial power mess around in the situations at home, et cetera. And so the use of immigrants as scapegoats it's a very particular form of anxiety activation that these far-right movements use. And when we see, like in Eastern Europe, where I actually had what's now a former friend explain to me that the North Africans were going to move up into Eastern Europe, and they were going to this person actually said this to me, they were going to murder them in their own beds. This trope that migrants are somehow actually a peril to individual people, more than just all this talk about how they want to they're wrecking our way of life, or they're freeloading, or whatever. What we're really actually, and Trump used this with his language around they're all rapists and bad people, et cetera, et cetera. They're activating very deep racist anxieties, but they're also playing upon the fact that we all know that with climate disaster and late stage capitalism, the goodies are over. Like it's up, like the whole jig is up now, and we are going to have to move towards cooperative forms of living and more collaborative forms of being populations together. And so I think that is how these global, they know that anxiety is present. They know that if they create the enemy, they can use it that way, but they're also fundamentally tapping into even if you don't actually believe in climate disaster, you cannot miss the fact that that resources are dwindling, and that there's less arable land in the United States, and that crops are failing. So even if you have some other fantastical answer for why that exists, you know that that's happening, and then the deep anxiety that people around the globe feel about that. So,
yeah, well, the code on Capitol Hill is increased variability in weather.
yes,
For those who don't want to say
increased variability in weather. And my basement flooded just this past week. I'm enjoying, increased variability in weather because of the atmospheric river that came through Seattle. So,
well, with that in mind, I want to thank those who have raised their electronic hand. And the first question goes to Steve Jens Rochelle. Please come off mute and ask your question.
I'm sorry, but I don't have a question.
Okay, well then we'll move along to Patrick. Patrick's iPhone 2. Patrick, if you can come off mute and ask your question. Oh, okay, then I'm not sure that, Patrick, we can't hear you. Okay, let's move along while Patrick figures this technology out, and we will ask Dee and Brad Harden to ask their question.
Thank you. I think something that took place some years ago has been some interesting insight into the differences and why we're so divided. Mitch McConnell was being interviewed by Charlie Rose, and at the end of the interview, Charlie asked Mitch, "Why do you think Republicans are better for the country than the Democrats?" And Mitch said, "Well, you know, Charlie, we Republicans are the party of free enterprise, and the Democrats are the party of the government." And I guess the question is, it seems like, wouldn't it be possible to have a form of capitalism where the balance between those two were better than it is now, where we have so many people that are really suffering, and we have so many people that are becoming even more and more wealthy? The Professor Robert Reich, I think, seems to agree with this, and I'm just wondering, how do you feel? Rather than giving up capitalism, trying to have it balanced better.
All right, well, you asked me. I personally, and I'm not speaking for UUSJ or anyone else here, but I personally think that that capitalism is not reformable because it's premised on continuous growth, right? So I personally think we have to move to some other way. The work of Gar Alperovitz, I know I love it. I'm just spitting out these names, and then some of you are scrambling in the chat to spell them out for each other, and I appreciate that. But Gar Alperovitz talks about different ways of organizing our economy so that we might still have forms of trade and private ownership, et cetera, but so I have found that to be helpful, but I actually really think that we have to create something different and new, and I don't think that we can mediate anymore a kinder, gentler form of capitalism.
Thanks for that answer, Reverend Cecilia. Patrick, do you have yourself off mute now? You ready to go with your question?
Yeah, I live very close to the border, and one of the things that I think we have forgotten in watching how many people are coming from Central American countries to our border is that in the 1970s and 1980s, we destroyed America, United States military, destroyed the economies of Central American countries by supporting their death squads. And we essentially destroyed the economy, leaving nothing but a drug-based cartel economy. And I hope we don't lose sight of historical forces that are creating what the right fears. You know, we did that. We met the enemy, they is us. And I guess my question is from Walter Benjamin, who quoted Bertolt Brecht when he was in exile as saying, it is good for an extreme reactionary movement to come into force after progressive times, and which is, I guess, the Marxist dialectic. I'm not a Marxist, but is it possible to see this as simply a reaction to those progressive movements that came about after, the voting rights bill, and then 1969 with the birth of gay liberation and women's liberation and Black Power and Chicano civil rights movements, and that there is perhaps hope, just looking at the progress of history, that that there will become that part of this is simply a natural progress of history, and that at the other end of this is a progressive movement or a synthesis of the libertarian and the leftist. And I think this one of the solutions that behooves us is to tell new stories, to tell different stories. John Didion said, we tell stories in order to live. And all the stories that I get from my media are negative, awful stories of constant photographs of disaster. And it behooves us to begin to tell new stories, more optimistic stories, stories of a progressive past. And I was wondering how you felt about looking at this as a Marxist dialectic or the progress of history.
Great question, Patrick. Thank you. It's I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. So I think you peppered Reverend Cecilia with actually like 3 questions in that. So let's allow her the opportunity to answer, and then we're going to go try and quickly hear a question from Denise, and then perhaps if we're lucky, Bill Harris. Keep your hands up, but
Yeah.
promises. Go for it, Reverend.
Yeah,
Cecilia.
there's a huge amount there. I guess just in the interest of time, and there was a lot of that we could discuss in your question, but just in the interest of time, literally in the interest of time, I don't think we have time to wait for cycles of history, because we are facing climate collapse and what that is going to mean. We don't. I'm also not a Marxist. I say I wish I was a Marxist sometimes, but I'm not. And I just don't. I don't think we can have sort of an academic engagement around how long this will take, or whether these are cycles. We have an emergency. We have a full bore emergency that we have to attend to right now, and that is going to require us to live in radically different ways very quickly. But I do agree with you that I think we need to tell different stories. I actually think that that's part of what we can bring as people of faith. I think we can tell stories about a present that is not onward and upward for the progress of mankind. It's not naive or silly about what we might achieve, but describes longings that we have for a new way of being human together. So.
Thank you. Denise. And
Hello.
Time, try to keep the question
I
short.
will keep it very short. I'm working with a man who's in prison, and he's wrongfully convicted and wrongfully imprisoned for 20 years. So we've been doing lots of stuff online, petitions and all that, and we've been being followed by the district attorney of one of the counties. And it appears that they're working with Facebook to shut us down and block our communications so that we can't get the petition done. So it's already doing what you have described. And it's kind of frightening. It's like to not be able to know what to do next. We're finding lots of ways to work around it. But, and also we were at a protest at the center, which is a public place, nonviolent. And they came out to my car and took down my license and all that. And I've actually done another one where they have reams on me, and I'm just a regular person that I'm not, I'm not a terrorist, but I'm being followed and getting I'm just like, what do I do about that besides working with people, like you said, being more of what we are doing? I mean, I think we have to go underground and just be more and more careful because it feels really serious.
It is serious. It is very serious. I've had some similar experiences in activist circles that I'm in Seattle. I think we do have to be more thoughtful and more careful about how we communicate. I think we need to have more security awareness, but I also am always mindful that this is something that one of my heroes, Timothy Snyder, talks about, which is it's really important for us not to obey in advance. It's really important for us to continue to use the rights and liberties that actually are not the government's to take away. Let me put it that way. It's more than just your civil liberties. It's the rights that we have as people who are, all people have these rights to speak freely and resist. And you have to know and have a community with whom you engage the questions of what does your risk entail to you personally or to your community. But I really want to urge us, particularly for me, I think about this as a person of relative privilege. I'm white, I'm cisgendered, I'm nominally straight, that, you know, I need to have more courage and less anxiety about what might happen to me as other people are bearing the serious brunt of these of resistance activities. So that was a short answer, but.
And I just want to dovetail here. I want to say I shorthand this as saying we as Unitarian Universalists have to learn to be, we have to learn about civic bravery. It's going to require all of that. Everything
Civic
that's being
bravery.
mentioned fits into the box of civic engagement, and we need to figure out how to be brave.
Love that.
So with that, I'm going to give the very last question to Bill, and then we're going to go to Reverend Kristen for closing out the our sacred space. But Bill, you got to be succinct and quick. You're speaking on mute, sir.
I'm so sorry. I want to tag on to the word brave. I'm not saying what I planned, but after the description of the lady, last lady, I think we must consider committing vigorously to telling one another when we experience these experiences so that everybody within our vocal range knows that there's some kind of, that kind of activity is going on. We need to uncover it, uncover it, uncover it. Thank you.
Amen to that. And with that, please, thank you for joining us, but we're going to hear from Reverend Kristen. So Reverend Kristen, close the sacred space for us, please.
Before I do that, I just want to say a great big thank you to Cecilia. I mean, every time I hear you talk, I feel like I learn so many new things. And I have a whole other new reading list as well. I think I'm just going to reiterate the end of my prayer in closing for us this evening. The sun and longer days of warmth and growth will return, and one day we will have cause to rejoice again. Inequity will melt, justice will roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. For the day of hope, the day of peace, the day of joy and love is coming, and we will be ready. We will watch, we will wait, and together we will do all that we can to prepare the way. May we all do all that we can.
Thank you so much, Reverend Kristen. Thank you so much, Reverend Cecilia. Now, those of you who are accustomed to UUSJ, you know that after the formal close, that's the soft close, I will hold some space, maybe answer some questions about UUSJ and allow you guys to sort of talk through and process a little bit what you heard. If you have something else going on in your evening and someplace else to be, please feel free to roll off and do that. If you want to jawbone with me or hear a little bit more about UUSJ, I'm going to be available for another 10 minutes or so. Thank you so much. And don't forget to vote. next year.